Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. One of the dominant recurring themes of this show since it began has been this relationship between discourse and practice, both at a large scale, as in how does the way we talk about design shape the industry? How do the platforms for design writing influence the discourse? But also on a personal level, how does writing about design shape how you design? And vice versa, how does being a practicing designer shape how you write? I've been interested in these questions really for the better part of 15 years now, both in my own work as a designer and a publisher, but also infrastructurally in thinking about how the ways we talk about design influences what design is and what design becomes. I've joked before that I love writing about design more than designing, and I love talking about writing about design more than writing. But anyway, because of this, I've always been on the lookout for new publications, new magazines, new publishing platforms that feel like they are trying to do new things, that are publishing content that seems like it wouldn't have a place anywhere else. There's one place over the last year or two that has really captivated me and really interested me and felt like an instructive model to look at, and that is a website called KoozArch. KoozArch was founded by Federica Sofia Zambeletti almost a decade ago when she was a student studying architecture at the Architectural Association in London. At the time, the site was a place to create conversations and networks about the role of the architectural drawing as a tool for communication in contemporary society. But over the years, it has grown into an independent publication platform and research studio that explores what they call the unbuilt imaginary. The site features a range of conversations and interviews, essays, and other writing, as well as partnerships with brands where KoozArch produces podcasts for organizations like Rearch or brands like Prada that all try to look at the role of architecture beyond the building. So in this episode, I invited Federica on the show to talk about KoozArch, what they are trying to do, how the site has evolved, where she sees it fitting into the larger architectural media landscape. We also talk about her time working in an architecture office and how that influenced her approach to publishing and media. And we also talk more broadly about the role of architecture and design media, the value of conversation as a format for discourse, and why drawing, the impetus for starting the site almost 10 years ago, is still an important theme for what they are doing now. Speaking of design media, do you like supporting independent design publications? Of course you do. Scratching the Surface is made possible fully because of your support, fully because of listener support. If you like what we do here, you can support the show by joining our paid Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that's filled with design news, updates on previous guests, and book roundups that is free for everyone. But the paid tier gets you exclusive content like bonus interviews, additional stories, and more. You can head to our website or look at the link in the show notes to sign up and help support all of this work that we're doing here at Scratching the Surface. Thank you so much for listening, and here is my conversation with Federica Sofia Zambeletti. I would actually like to begin the conversation really at a kind of foundational level, and I'm wondering if you could describe what KoozArch is. How do you think about what this site, this project, this publication, this magazine is? How do you describe it? How do you talk about it?
Well, after many ponderings, we have come to really define Kooz as an independent publishing platform and a research studio. It started off as a project when I was a student actually at the Architectural Association. And there was more, let's say, a collection of projects. Then we thought, okay, it's a magazine, but now we feel quite confident that it is an independent publishing platform. And for us, the notion of independence is extremely interesting and important. And then the fact of it being a research studio, it's something which has evolved in the last year and which has, however, become an integral part of what KoozArch is today.
So I have two. I don't mean to like be picky with your word choice there, but tell me more about the difference between a magazine and a publishing platform. Why does publishing platform feel like a good word or a good term for what you're doing?
Yeah, magazine somehow we always got questioned to the point of, is it print? And for us, it's never really been print. So magazine was always associated with that, and already created a quite fixed format. At least in my mind, the idea of a magazine seemed a little bit restricted. Whilst platform offers the idea of a space of exchange. I mean, a platform is a platform where people can encounter, whether in the digital or in the real. And KoozArch really is very much about encounters. So platform in that sense works well. And we also are here to platform voices, right? So
Yeah.
also the idea of the platform as an act in and of itself is something that we associate with very much. And that's how we came to kind of define that as a notion with which we associate compared to the magazine.
And then tell me about the research studio part. What you said that's a more integral part of what you're doing now. What does that look like? What's the output of that? How does that connect to these larger questions of publishing and platforming that you're talking about?
Well, research has always been an integral part of KoozArch as a platform, but also of me as a practicing architect and as a researcher. So it's been part of the work that I've been doing with the other office that I collaborated with for 7 years. And then last year, actually, we decided to participate in this kind of call well, not actually a call to this grant, which was announced by the municipality of Milan. And the kind of subject of the grant was to develop a project on urban regeneration, which would ultimately be formulated as a publication. And that's when the research studio came into place, because at that point, it wasn't so much contents and knowledge which was being shared on the platform and which tackled, let's say, the broader agenda of KoozArch, but it was really a specific project. So looking at urban regeneration within the context of Milan with a specific output. And that was a project which really was really pivotal in Kooz's standing in really, first of all, looking at a very tangible reality of architecture. I mean, really looking at the urban scale, looking at Milan. And we started to actually look at a number of abandoned buildings within the city. So, and understand how those could be offer themselves as opportunities to tackle those which are the two major crises which Milan as a city, but a lot of other cities worldwide are facing, which on the one hand is the environmental crisis, and on the other hand is the housing crisis. So Milan suffers from a huge, let's say, urban heat island phenomenon and permeability of the soil. And on the other hand, there is kind of really no affordable housing left. So we started really looking into more than 150 abandoned buildings. And rather than seeing them as a weight to the city, really looking at them as an opportunity. And that was really when the research part of the studio got formalized, and which signal, a little bit this next phase of Kooz.
So I have one more general question just about the site and how you think about the site. And you're talking about you're doing this research, getting grants, kind of creating knowledge. You're also creating platforms for conversation, for discussion. You publish interviews, you publish essays, you work with others to do podcasts and audio type things. What thematically ties those together? What makes a KoozArch story a KoozArch story? Or how do you think about your editorial purview for the platform?
Well, for the longest time, up to actually 2 weeks ago, we always
Perfect
defined.
timing.
Well, yeah, I did anticipate that you were catching me and Kooz at a quite interesting moment. So up until 2 weeks ago, we always defined our agenda as that which focused on the unbuilt. So, and this really comes from the fact that KoozArch was born when I was a student at the Architectural Association. The Architectural Association is a university which really pushes the idea of architecture as a practice and as a discipline which expands beyond built buildings. And there, as a student, when I was asked to research and to do my project, somehow there wasn't really a space where a similar kind of architectural discourse was nurtured. Rather, we were invited to go and look at magazines which really platformed, to use a word, kind of architecture and design artifacts. And for me, I always a little bit resented that, right? Because I was being taught that architecture is so much more than built buildings, but at the same time, all the kind of magazines and media and outlets which were out there really looked at architecture and design in their built form. So Kooz really started off with this idea of saying, okay, how can we look at the unbuilt? How can we look at those researches and ideas which discuss our built environment and which generate our built environment without specifically focusing on the artifact? And of course, when I was at university, that meant platforming the work of students as myself, really also very much as not only with the ambition of platforming the individual project, but with the ambition of really creating a network of ideas, whereby if you were studying at the AA, you could be exposed to the ideas which were being nurtured at other universities, whether this was in New York, Mumbai, Cape Town, or wherever. So this idea of really always working as a network is something which has been inherent to KoozArch. And what makes Content Kooz, apart from this idea of really being attuned to the research and to the idea and to process, is this idea of also really engaging in architecture as a multidisciplinary practice. So we don't always talk about architecture, but we refer to our built environment. And we think that everyone has the right to talk about our built environment. And it's interesting to look at it from different perspectives. So not always having architects speak about it, but engaging artists, philosophers, policymakers, right? And in that sense, what makes something Kooz is also the multi-generational aspect. So for us, it is important that we platform voices of young practitioners as much as established voices and really create that space where these exchanges can happen. So ultimately, it's not ever, or it's seldomly about what we write, but who we bring together in conversation. And that's something that really has always been at the basis of Kooz, is the format of the conversation rather than the idea of the review. Like, how can KoozArch bring together practitioners? How can we create the space for that exchange? And that's what I think what makes Kooz what it is, and how it's been operating up until two weeks ago when we talked about the unbuilt. Now, as I actually quit the architecture practice where I worked for more than 7 years, where I was a practicing architect, as soon as that happened, I ultimately felt the necessity of saying, okay, but where do the built buildings come in, right? I mean, how can I remain rooted to the practice and really also platform those architectures which are really responding to the multiple crises that we are facing today? And at that point, with the team, we started really thinking, okay, what are those? How can we create the space for buildings that matter? And also to really address this idea of building as research. So even in this next phase, when we will start talking and addressing built artifacts, it's never looking at the built building, let's say, as an abacus of materials or solutions, but rather talking about it in how it addresses the crisis that we're, living through today, and also what kind of research is being undertaken through that research, because there is this idea of the building as a form of research, right?
Yeah. I mean, you set up probably every other question that I'm going to ask you in that answer. So I want to pick some things out here and talk about them more specifically. And I want to go back to your time at the Architectural Association when you're a student and you're starting KoozArch. Can you, I realize this is 10 years ago. You started the site in 2013. Is that right? What were you interested in at the time? What was you're obviously studying architecture. You have some interest in being an architect, I think, maybe. Can you tell me a little bit about like what your headspace was like? Why starting a site? Why this idea of networking was interesting to you as a architecture student?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because actually the whole reason I got into architecture was because I had a huge passion for art.
Okay.
So, and it's I don't know. I see my life a little bit as a sequence of maybe unexpected or just opportunities that I have grasped. But I was always interested in curatorship,
Mm,
in art, in museums. And this friend of my father's, actually, curiously, the curator of design and architecture at MoMA, Paolo Antonelli,
mm.
my father was like, okay, look, I think there's one person that can answer whether you're going to study art history or architecture, and that's Paola. And
I
I was
love
like,
that.
okay. And I mean, imagine like a 17-year-old terrorized person of saying, oh my God, I'm going to speak to like the head curator of
Yeah.
architecture and design at MoMA. Like, what am I going to tell her? And she's like, look, it's very simple. If you want to be a curator, you need to understand space.
Uh,
You need to understand how people move in space. So I would really advocate for you to study architecture. And then, I mean, if you want to do a master's in art history, there's always time for that. So that's how I entered the AA. And obviously, then it was quite beautiful to find myself in a university where the attention to drawing was
mhm.
really prominent, right? There, the drawing is both verb and noun, and it's really part of the process. So KoozArch started really with the idea of platforming beautiful drawings and understanding how through
Yeah.
those beautiful drawings we could talk about an architectural process and an architectural idea. So it was never really focusing on the kind of orthogonal plan, section, axonometric, but rather giving space to those drawings who would talk about a different kind of architecture and really talking about ideas. I
Mhm.
mean, if one goes to the AA archive, you have drawings by Zaha, by Rem. I mean, a
Yeah.
really wonderful collection. And so the platform really started with this idea, with a focus on representation. And I think that kind of goes back to my passion for art and curatorship.
I found an interview that you had given in 2016, and you described the
Oh
site.
wow,
You
you're a
say
serial digger.
that's right. You say our ambition is to revive and advertise the beauty of drawing architecture at a time when the hyper-realistic render has become a more prominent element of visualization. I'm curious about this role of drawing and how you think about the site today. Are there threads that connect that early ambition when you're a student and you're thinking about drawing the visualization and the way you're talking about the site now, which is much more ambitious, both in what you're doing, but also in the editorial purview that you were just talking about, feels feels more ambitious to me than just being about drawing and visualization and the sort of the media of architecture. How do you see the relationship between 10 years ago KoozArch and what you're trying to do now?
Well, at the end of the day, I think it goes back to why we were drawing, right? So, drawing there represented a form of research,
Mm,
which one would undertake through academia. So, at the AA, you drew to kind of research and investigate your topic. Whilst as my practice evolved, as I graduated, I started working in an architecture office. There actually, and what was interesting there is that obviously I worked, well, not so obviously, it was quite a unique practice in the sense that we had on the one hand the architecture office, and on the other hand there was a nonprofit agency for change.
mm,
And there, for example, we did a research. We started off with a research on Antarctica, which was formalized as a publication published with Lars Muller in 2021, which was then presented in a number of exhibitions. But what was interesting there is that even there, the act of drawing was extremely important once again as a form of research. So we did a number of cartographies showcasing X
mm,
amount of topics
mhm.
and conditions of Antarctica, which no one had really looked at because a lot of geographers look at the geography to the geomorphology, whilst we were interested in understanding settlements. So we were looking at
Mm.
the more than 76 stations, understanding how those stations tied into the kind of geopolitics of the continent.
Yeah.
So we like there, the act of drawing also became an extremely interesting device through which to unveil certain narratives and certain kind of politics which had never been, I mean, which everyone knew about, but hadn't really been crystallized. And the beauty there was both the idea of the act of drawing as a process and as a research, but also as a means to unveil and
Yeah.
unfold.
Yeah.
And that, I think, it's something that the architect really has in their toolbox. So maybe now in some of the conversations, drawing isn't there so much. Although when we have the opportunity, of course, we also talk about the importance of representation. It was interesting because
Yeah.
I just got off a conversation with Javier Orzaucin from the World Monument Fund and Miriam Hilawi. And we were talking about Miriam's, I mean, and both their research and work on the Lalibela hewn churches. So, of course, WMF has been working on preservation activities for the last 8 years. Miriam, and tangible, let's say,
Yeah.
activities, conservation practices. Also, Miriam has been working on a digital twin, on translating that and into a video game. And then she did a kind of physical installation for the Sharjah Architecture Triennale last year. And what was interesting is that through those formats of representation, she was able to unfold different narratives which are sometimes hidden and which one is not
Yeah.
exposed to,
Yeah.
and then engage different publics. So sometimes drawing comes back, but what ultimately drawing was always about was really research and process, and that is still very much at the heart of what KoozArch is today.
Yeah, and as you say that, it makes me think about the way you were talking about thinking about like, well, where are the buildings now? Where do buildings fit into this? And you're talking about the buildings themselves as being a manifestation of responding to the set of crises, which is sort of what drawing is doing. Drawing is a way to work through these ideas, and in many ways the building is doing that also. And so this relationship between the artifact and the idea seems like a key element to how you think about this work. Does that sound right to you at all?
Yeah, and I mean, and what's interesting is I was in Copenhagen last week, and there I went to this building site with a young architect. His name is Søren Pilman. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, and he's working on this adaptive reuse. And there it was just incredible because it's as if it was really a drawing which unfolded in 3 dimensions, and there it's really building his research. And I was really truly impressed by the work, and I was like, okay, this, like, such a project cannot exist. I mean, for sure it can exist in other magazines which also
Right.
showcase, let's say, shiny buildings, which are, I mean, are full of capital and so forth.
Yeah.
But actually they also need a space in a platform which really cherishes process, right? And that's how now the buildings come into Kooz, really. And it was just so beautiful because when we were going through the construction site, I could just also imagine the drawing, right? And another time, actually more than a month ago, I was near Vicenza with this other practice called AMA. And there we visited a number of projects that they did. And then the last project that we visited was actually the house of one of the two founding partners. And there was never a drawing. All the decisions he made on site with the
Wow.
workers. And that for me was another moment in which I was like, wow. So, okay, so sometimes really the building becomes your drawing board, right? And it's a way of doing architecture which comes really from kind of a very intuitive practice in really understanding how the building operates and what the potential of the building is, which sometimes the drawing doesn't enable you to feel and see. And that's why there's
Right.
ever so more. I mean, you draw something, then you go on site. But this fact that the drawing just never existed, and you would see the walls with X amount of sketches, and it was just really beautiful to see also the generative power of being just on site and listening to a building.
I want to stay on this thread for a second about this relationship between kind of the research and the object, or the process and the output, because I'm curious how you approach this and how you related to this in your own work, because it's interesting to me that you graduated from the AA and you were running KoozArch a little bit on the side. This was a thing you were doing. You were collecting these drawings, you were posting these, you were sort of thinking editorially, but then you go and you work for a studio. How did those relate to each other? Or did you see any interaction between sort of the work, what you were actually doing, and then this other project that you had going on the side? How did those start to interact with each other?
I don't think there was really a kind of, I mean, for a long time, or not for a long time, for a period of time, I don't think there was a kind of a direct relationship between the two, if not in one single thing, which is this idea of the architect as a mediator. So,
Mm,
in the kind of work that I did, both with the architecture office and the nonprofit, as an architect and as a kind of the project manager of Antarctic Resolution, I was always bringing actors together.
mm,
And within the architecture parts, especially, we were always working within listed buildings and with artists, or at least with with cultural projects. So when you're working in a listed building, when you're working with an artist, obviously, I mean, you put yourself a little bit on the sidelines, right? So you're there to
yeah.
mediate, you're there to do justice to the building, and you're there to do justice to the client. So, in that sense, I really, what I enjoyed was this ability of put myself and my practice there in the hindsight, in the shadows, and not
Uh,
claiming this idea of, okay, this grand ego, which sometimes architects tend to have,
yeah,
but
yeah,
rather being there as a mediator. And that's really what also I kept on doing with Kooz, the idea of working as a moderator. Um, and that's something, and those are, that's the kind of parallel that I saw for the longest time. Then, of course, we were working a lot with artists. And so really understanding the beauty through which
hmm
artists look at space, which is
hmm
inherently very different to the way that architects. And so, in that sense, I was always very interested in the artist's perspective. And that's why we've engaged in conversations with Doho Su, with Rachel
yeah,
Whiteread, and those are practitioners, for example, which really engage with space. But for example, even today we published an interview with Bukhra, and she's obviously an artist, and it's on an ongoing exhibition in Sharjah, and that is less spatial in the sense that, of course, she's not like Rachel Whiteread, which looks at, I mean, does a cast, like a negative cast of a building, but rather it's super spatial because obviously she also traces, let's say, migrant routes. So there is a
mm-hmm.
wider understanding of space and of what and how people weave space together and those kind of geographies. So maybe it wasn't so direct. But what's funny is that the moment that I stopped practicing like a month back is the moment that I was like, oh my God, like I actually need that practice. And somehow I was always very scared of quitting architecture because I was like, okay, but how can I continue to run an architecture and design magazine if I'm not practicing?
Yeah,
But I realized that, and it's also one of the reasons why after 7 years, I decided to quit, is that I was also a little bit in a weird limbo in the sense that on the one hand, we were doing research on Antarctica and talking about the melting of Antarctica due to anthropogenically induced climate change. But on the other hand, I was part of an industry which is one of the biggest polluters,
hmm
right?
hmm
So I was like, okay, maybe my agency now lies a little bit more in creating a space where one can platform those building practices which are a little bit more regenerative, which are a little bit
yeah.
more caring and careful of their imminent and maybe not so imminent, but also planetary impact.
I have I think what you said is so interesting, and I really relate to that as somebody who also for a long time was a practitioner and somebody who was writing and publishing, and I felt that need to do both. Like I felt like I couldn't write or do this show if I wasn't also designing. And I have like a couple questions that I'm going to try to frame in a way that gives you space to answer them. But just for some context, so you've been working as an architect alongside KoozArch up until a couple of weeks ago. You're now full time KoozArch. How are you navigating that now? I realize you're sort of this is still all new to you to be fully out of practice, but are you already seeing changes in how you think about your work not having that other side? Do you still, tell me about this sense of like, oh, I need, how can I publish these things if I'm not also practicing? Do you still feel that now? Is some of that dissipating? Just like walk me through your headspace, I guess. I want to know how you're thinking about it in this moment of transition.
Well, actually, I mean, the fact is that before I was obviously working a lot with, let's say, existing buildings, but also a lot with exhibition design. And obviously, exhibition design is the kind of pinnacle also. I mean, okay, we're not looking at, if one looks at the kind of constructions and demolitions in China, exhibition design is infinitesimal in terms of the impact. But it is, however, it does have an impact. So at the time, I was like, okay, but if I'm not practicing, then as you said, like where does my legitimacy come from? But at the same time, I was looking at my practice and I'm like, okay, but I'm doing exhibition design, right? So I, not that architects need to save lives, but I was doing something which is very elitist in a certain sense. And the research in Milan really was a moment, a groundbreaking moment, because it really opened up this idea of actually maybe even if I'm not practicing anymore, I have the power to put people in conversation, establish contacts, give space to the research that matters. And that for me was just, it just got to a point and it was really, it was quite funny. It was a kind of a eureka moment in Timisoara. So I've been traveling for the past month and a half, a little bit nonstop. We handed over the research on the 30th of September, and mid-September, I went to Timisoara for the Triennale or Biennale actually, which was curated by Ioana Stanescu. I hope I pronounced that also correctly. And it was interesting because I was really surrounded by extremely strong women, one being Oana, the other being Malkit Shoshan. And Oana created a really important space, or at least a space where one could really feel, I don't know, empowered. I don't know what happened that weekend, but we had a session. It was quite peculiar. There was a kind of like a therapeutic session
Yeah, yeah.
in which this psychoanalyst or psychologist, not too sure. Anyway, something with psycho. She had us kind of get into groups and gave us a little sentence that we needed to finish. And so I was in the group with Oana and this other gentleman, and our phrase was like, I have a tiny little secret. So we had to do like a dance, and then when we had to each say, I have a tiny little secret, and then just blurt it out. And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm gonna try and see how this sounds. So Oana like goes, she says her tiny little secrets, and it was quite sweet because obviously she was tired. She was like, I just want to cry, like I'm just overwhelmed by the amount of stress. And it really created quite a safe space because it's
Hmm.
not everywhere that you have a condition of being together in such a space. And the
Right.
curator is like, you know what? I actually feel really vulnerable right now. I'm tired. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go for it. So I say, I have a tiny little secret. I think I'm gonna quit my job. And they and and everyone was like, wow, you go for it, girl, right? So that's the first moment I said it out loud. And then just thinking, and obviously, I mean, at the beginning it was hard, but I then went really for a month and a half on a number of travels around Tbilisi for the Biennale, then Tallinn also for an architecture Biennale. And there I met a friend. He was like, look, we're having this book come out in Brussels. Every 2 years, they do this book in which they platform like the most significant architectures which have been built in the last 2 years. And he was
Mm.
like, look, I would really like to invite you on the press tour. I was like, are you sure? I mean, KoozArch doesn't address built buildings. He was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. And at that point, I was like, okay. And I started reading the book, and the projects were just so incredible. And I realized that there was so much more that I could learn from those
Mm.
in this, and that I wanted to learn from those. And of course, having been an architect for 7 years, not that I'm not going to be an architect anymore, but having practiced architecture for 7 years, I feel the struggles. I think 7 years is enough to understand what the struggles are, to maybe take a step back for some time and say, okay, now I want to understand and really be engaged
Right.
with the good practices and create a space for those rather than maybe being still engaged in practice, but for projects which are maybe less aligned to where I see my agency now.
As you were talking through that, I was thinking about the overlaps or the intersections between what I'm going to call media, like design media, architecture media, these publishing platforms, and the practice itself. And then we could add like a third component to that and talk about maybe academia and education. And I think, especially you've navigated all of those, and KoozArch has sort of sat between all of those. It started when you were a student, it started in an academic environment, and then you continued it when you were in practice, and now you are kind of leaving practice, I guess we can say, and you're fully in this media world. What How do you think about how those three worlds talk to each other, how they should talk to each other, how they should overlap, the relationship between them generally? Do you have thoughts on that? Maybe I'm asking you a question that I'm trying to think about on my own, but I feel like often there's big gaps between how each of those distinct areas talk about the work, the way practitioners talk about the work, the way work is publicized, the way work is talked about in an academic setting often can feel different. And I'm wondering how we bring those together or how we start to triangulate those in a more efficient way. Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm does
Yeah,
that
no, no,
or-
it makes sense. And I should say, I've been talking in the kind of singular I, but Kuz is a team effort. So I think it's correct to say that when we're thinking through, we're always a number of minds thinking through
right.
these kind of relationships. And for us, it's really always important that it is that Kuz really addresses the intersection between academia, media, and building. And for the
Mm,
longest time, I do think that media has been very tied to the part of building and has totally neglected the part of academia. Whilst for us, it's extremely important. I mean, Kuz actually starts from the realm of academia to then
hmm.
bridge to that of building. And of course, in this, it was extremely important the kind of chief editors that we've had through time, and the chief editor with which we collaborate now, which is Shumi Bose, to which I'm eternally grateful for really her mind power and her generosity and really mindfulness and really like very easily, it seems from the outside, weaving all these points together. And of course,
Mm,
Shumi is extremely grounded in academia in the sense that she teaches in
right.
London. And she's really attuned to that word, that world, that audience, but is also very skillful in kind of taking a step back. And
Mm,
and in that sense, we never really publish kind of academic contents per se in the sense of
right.
academic papers, but it's always in terms of nurturing those conversations across academic and cultural institutions. So in this sense, I think KoozArch works very well as a platform which is able to bridge these three worlds in a way that I'm hopeful will be very generative to diverse audiences, which maybe to date have only looked at KoozArch for the academic part and
Mm,
the more research part. And I'm hopeful that there will be an interest in also understanding the built part and how these two can really relate, really, because there's always this kind of gap between academia and building. I mean,
yeah.
when you're
Yeah.
in academia, you're not building. When you're in building, sometimes you're in academia as a professor, and I think there's an extreme strength in that, but somehow the two worlds always remain detached. Whilst I think now in the coming months it will be an interesting challenge for us to understand how we can really bridge and create those points of
Yeah.
exchange between those disciplines and those practices.
Yeah, how do you see KoozArch fitting into the larger architecture and design media landscape? You made a comment earlier that I wanted to go back to, where when you're touring this building site with the designer and you're like, oh, KoozArch is the place where we could talk about this. Like it would be hard to find a platform to talk about these ideas. How how do you sort of situate yourself within this larger landscape? Where are you fitting in that no one else is doing things? Can you sort of just talk about
Yeah.
that landscape and how you think about it?
So, I mean, the struggle is real in the sense that a lot of magazines today are funded by the industry,
Right.
by material suppliers, by contractors. So a lot of the time when they talk about buildings, they talk about buildings in the form of specs and
Right.
really as an abacus of products. Whilst the building like the one that I visited is really the product of a process of of an architect and who's extremely aware of the kind of impact that the construction industry has and who's decided to center his practice on this idea of adaptive reuse.
Mhm.
So for us, it's important that really the kind of projects that KoozArch nurtures and platforms are really those which think differently in terms of
Mm.
how they position themselves in relation to what's happening in the wider world. And of course, the environmental impact is one of them. I think there's platforms which, yeah, on the one hand are really kind of dedicated to that kind of those kind of material suppliers, and so I mean what they publish is inherently tied to what
Right.
those kind of suppliers want, and that's why I really stressed this idea of independence at the beginning of our conversation, which is an independence which I truly cherish because it enables us to talk about those buildings that we want to talk about without feeling as if we need to label them according to, I don't know, a
Right.
particular window supplier, door supplier. But even more
Right.
importantly, it enables us to also tackle those topics which a lot of platforms shy away today. So, for example, talking about Sudan, talking about Palestine, those are conversations we want to host, and our independence enables us to host those conversations and to platform those voices at a time when so many magazines, because of their non-independence, cannot host, right? So in that sense, that building, I thought it was interesting to create a space whereby one would go on KoozArch because they know that the buildings that we have selected and which are featured are really because there's been a kind of an extremely curatorial and editorial decision.
Hmm.
So I'm sure that it's great, and I believe that it's great that those are also platformed on the kind of, I don't know, more kind of mass media. But it just becomes a pity when those then get lost because the amount of noise in
Yeah.
terms of really shiny facades of capital are the neighbors in that kind of magazine or digital space.
How has I'm curious how you've seen the architecture, design, media landscape evolve over the last 10 years that you have been publishing, because everything you say I agree with. It's interesting to me that there still feels like a big gap for deep, thoughtful writing and ideas about design that is not quite academic, but is also not just sort of glorified press releases. There's a space there for new types of discourse and new types of media. But it also strikes me that the last 10 years have seen the media landscape change profoundly from, I mean, just thinking about 2013, 14 with sites like Tumblr, and Twitter was still something you could kind of use and not hate yourself with. And like those have fallen away. The rise of video and kind of social media and algorithms have changed how we consume media. What changes have you seen and how are you thinking about navigating those?
Well, of course, I think, I mean, the last 10 years have really brought to a little bit of an exacerbation of the kind of distracted
That's a great way to
audience.
put it. Yeah.
Exactly, of the distracted audience in the sense of quick, flashy content. And KoozArch really kind of takes a stance against that.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I think that in the last 8 years, there have been those kind of big platforms. Few of them have survived, and a lot of them have been sold off. And they now really go on the basis of how many clicks are you able to obtain, and that has really obviously proliferated this idea of short content where one clicks and they're either clickbaits or they're short kind of pills to digest. But that, I think, as you said, has also left a little bit of a space for independent realities to emerge. And I think also that has really enabled independent realities to emerge. Of course, as I said before, the struggle is real in the sense that it's hard to kind of fund these realities. And if I look at KoozArch as an example, I think the beauty of Kooz is a little bit that I was never in the publishing industry. So I just got to it from a kind of an architecture perspective. So it's just like, okay, how will we make ends meet? And it's just been a super creative exercise. But of course, it's a creative exercise which really requires a lot of passion. I mean, KoozArch now is, I think it's standing on its own 2 feet and it's doing extremely well. But KoozArch was also 10 years of a lot of sleepless nights, mornings, like
Yeah.
a super passion project that if I think back, and I mean, my husband jokes, but my computer is my second husband, at times my first husband. And it's just because the amount of attention that
Yeah.
an independent publishing platform requires is infinite. So the pity is that, as a certain point, sometimes if the passion is not there anymore, or if life takes a hold of oneself, and so one doesn't have the time to dedicate to these projects, then they can also they're very delicate in their own standing. And of course, that's, for example, also what happened to OneCube a few years back, which was an incredible source of
Yeah.
inspiration for us. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of resistance in kind of these independent platforms, but it's also a matter of how can you then find a structure whereby you maintain your independence, but you're able to pay the bills. And for us, that has really always been a fact of engaging in media partnerships and collaborations with institutions and with brands with which we share an ethos. And it's not easy because sometimes we've been approached by institutions or realities with which we didn't share an ethos, but there was
Mm.
a money which maybe could have kept us running for another 6 months without even having to question. And we were like, okay, thank you, but no thank you, because at the end of the day, it's important that Kooz really maintains its independence at a time when so many other magazines have kind of sold theirs and have also gone into kind of creating formats. And I was really shocked. And when I read, for example, the book by Renier de Graaf, Architect Verb,
Oh
when
yeah.
he talks about awards, right? And how awards have become this kind of money making machines for magazines. And I had never really realized, but it is, right? So now the kind of publishing like magazines have had to engage in the production of honestly useless awards, or at least
Right.
not meaningful awards, whereby you have to pay to submit your project and then pay to
Hmm.
submit to go to the event. I mean, it seems like a little bit of a joke.
Yeah.
And it seems a joke when, for example, I don't know, a week ago, as I said, I was in Copenhagen and I was there for the Obel Award and their annual, let's say, ceremony. And it was so refreshing to be in conversation with a foundation who actually praises not even projects, because they change. Like sometimes it's a project, sometimes it's an individual. This time it was
Mm.
36 public works by this collective in Mexico called C733. And really, there you're like, okay, this award has meaning. So for us, it's a matter of, okay, KoozArch needs to have meaning in every single thing that we do. And it's a struggle, but it's really, really important. So to maybe, I mean, maybe I've navigated a bit too far, but I just think that it is a little bit of a pity that now it's so hard to keep these kind of platforms going. But if one does, then I don't know, I wake up every morning and with a huge smile on my face, and I hope that the Kooz team does the same. I know, for example, today Shumi wrote an email and she's like, yes, I'm working these 3 days and then any other second that I can get because I love working on the Kooz. And that you're like, wow, it's so beautiful to actually have a team which, I mean, goes that extra mile. And it's not something that one should ever take for granted.
I really relate to that. And I mean, in many ways, that's what I'm doing with this show and the work that I do. And it's similar that I didn't come up in media. I found my way into this through design. And so everything you say relates to the work that I do and resonates with me very, very clearly. I feel a lot of synergies there. Another thing that I feel like we share in common, and you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to spend some time talking about it, is this idea of conversation. Um, we've obviously been having a conversation for 45 minutes now or so. Conversation has been central to KoozArch from the beginning. Conversation is something that's important to me and my work. You also just mentioned doing sort of brand partnerships and working with other people. You've been working with the Rearch Institute, doing a podcast for them, working with Prada on the Prada Frames, kind of a podcast component. How does conversation change the design discourse? What do you find valuable about the dialogue as a format for discussing ideas?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's this idea of creating that space for exchange. And once again, you do find us at a very interesting time in the sense that the kind of two podcasts that we have done has created a little bit of an appetite to create our own. So
Mm.
in January, we will be launching our own podcast, which will
Oh,
be
nice.
titled The Space Between. And there we will always, the ambition is to always have a spatial practitioner in conversation with a kind of an outsider, if one can call it that. Really with the ambition of challenging the conversation as a means of bringing different perspectives in conversation with architecture and the built environment. So for us, the conversation really is a fertile ground to nurture new perspectives and new alliances, both within and without the discipline. And that's something which doesn't happen with an essay
Right.
and doesn't happen with a review, because it's always a kind of us writing and us reviewing. And that goes back a little bit to this idea of authorship, which I'm really not fond of. I think architecture should not really be a kind of a discipline where we seek authorship, and that's why I'm also very much interested in how architects who work with adaptive reuse position themselves in relation to the existing building. That's what I find most stimulating, right? So it's not
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
your project, but it's you trying to work with a building and understanding the building. So for us, conversations really are an important way in which we are able to really work on this idea of the multidisciplinary and the multi-generational, which are at the true core of KoozArch. And in this sense, I do feel that it's important that I also refer a little bit back to our team, because I mean, of course, Shumi has an architecture background, but for example, Anna, who's our project manager and really the backbone of Kooz, is trained in the visual arts, right?
Mm.
So this idea of the multidisciplinary is really also a little bit in our small
Yeah.
team, rooted a little bit in the team. And the three of us are as much engaged in finding conversation partners as each and every one of us.
Yeah.
And that's something that's very important.
I love that. And I think that's really well said. I mean, what a conversation does is it allows a thought partner. It allows you to work out these ideas in real time. And there's something generative about that you don't get in the essay or the review, like you said. And so I'm very curious to hear the new podcast when that comes out. You've said a couple times you're in this moment of transition. You just left your other job, you're focusing on this. The site is there's a lot of energy behind it right now. Can you talk about anything else that's upcoming, or where you see KoozArch going over the next couple years?
I mean, I think what's beautiful about KoozArch is how it's driven by curiosity and experimentation. So there isn't a precise, let's say, agenda in saying, okay, we want to be there in 5 years' time, but we know the kind of topics that we want to continue to dabble with. We know
Mm.
that we are a digital publishing platform at the moment, but we also very nurture the physical. So we're interested in understanding how we can create those moments of exchange by potentially curating more symposia moments when
Mm.
people can come together, whether it's through a symposium conversation, whether it's through an exhibition, really just understanding what other platforms and formats we can use to ensure that we kind of broaden a little bit our audience. And that's something that was extremely interesting. For example, when we were doing the research in Milan, which ultimately will become a publication. And for us, we shied away from the idea of academic essays, which freaked out a lot of the kind of conversation partners that we engaged, because obviously a lot of them were academics, and they're like, oh, so I cannot write like a 4,000 word essay. I was like, no, you will engage in a conversation. Or if you want, like the essay needs to be 1,500 words long. And that was really with the ambition of testing another format. Like Koos had never done a publication, but we knew that the moment that we wanted to put out a publication, it was a publication which could really bridge the gap between architects, because otherwise if we keep on talking to each other, then nothing can really come out of it. So this ties also a little bit back to your question before in terms of the conversation. So for us, it's important that we continue to have these conversations. Where and how they're hosted is something that we're experimenting with, ever so more understanding what a physical space that could inhabit. And ultimately, as I said, I mean, I got into Koos because I was interested in curatorship. So that is an agenda that I think we will ever so more continue to explore. But as a lot of things in my life and in how Koos has evolved is really jumping on opportunities, I do also see Koos as something flexible, which will continue to evolve, as I said, on the basis of curiosity, but also jumping on opportunities which are presented to us. And really also always listening to the kind of direction in which the world moves and the kind of conversations and realities that the world needs. And that's why I'm ever so grateful that in our team, we do have very acute listeners who are able, although we are kind of geographically bound in a kind of a Western-centric perspective, the idea is to really understand how we can nurture conversations which platform the voices of people who are geographically around the world, and really create a platform which responds to kind of those necessities. So it's not a fixed trajectory, although I do believe potentially, hopefully, that in 20 years' time, there will be a fil rouge which links everything together. But at the moment, it's really a matter of letting our curiosity guide us, and also always being acute listeners to how the world shifts and what it needs in terms of discourse.
I love that. I have one more question for you. I want to go back to something you said earlier. So you're 17, 18 years old, and your father introduces you to Paola Antonelli to figure out if you should study architecture or art history. And she tells you you need to understand space and you should study architecture. Was she right? How do you think about that advice and that conversation now with the work that you're doing now? Was studying architecture the right way to go? Did that side of it bring something to this work that you wouldn't have had otherwise?
Absolutely. I mean, forever grateful. And what's really funny is that actually I kind of always resented architecture somehow, however, until I did my I don't know how you call, but when I became an architect, of course, in the UK, you have part one, part two, part three here. You take one exam and you become a licensed architect. And before, we would travel to cities and we would have an arty tour, and my husband would hate me for it because it would mean traveling around museums after galleries and so forth. And then when, I don't know why, but when I really kind of um, indulged myself and submerged myself into the dryness of sitting through the architecture exam, and this was during the pandemic, there I don't know why, I suddenly discovered architecture. And so it became so much more of a spatial question for me in the last 3 to 4 years. And when we visit now cities, we go on an archi tour. So, well, at least he's happy now. He's like, finally, we're not like closed in buildings, but actually we're within the city. But that is to say that I somehow always thought that, I mean, it was a very good decision. I was always very tied to this idea of art. and more seeing paintings and seeing sculptures rather than inhabiting space. Whilst now it's much more of inhabiting space and understanding space, and then whether there's an art, it's fantastic. But that kind of also reflects a little bit back on the kind of decision that I took in the last month, right? Not to work for cultural projects anymore, but really understand the value of space. And architecture enables me to do that. So for 7 years, I've been engaged in cultural projects, and now it's really working on how architecture, to really reflecting upon where architecture should go. And that for sure means looking at adaptive reuse of buildings, looking at those kind of transformations, and really understanding what experimentations are necessary, and also building materials. And I feel that that is something that obviously architecture has given me, and I'm curious to, and I'm happy to be able to have built KoozArch in the last few years as a platform which can now hold that knowledge.
Yeah. And so thank you, Paula, for that advice.
Yes.
You this is all possible from that conversation. Federica, thank you so much for this conversation. Like I said, I feel a lot of synergy with how you think about the work you're doing and the work that I'm doing. And it was really nice to hear how you are thinking through all of it and navigating it. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
No, thank you, especially for offering this space within such an interesting period. It was a good moment to try to jot things down, but then at the same time, as I said, to also use it a little bit as a brainstorming exercise. So, Jarrett, thank you for offering the podcast as a space to discuss my practice and your practice together today.
That was my conversation with Federica Sofia Zambeletti. It was recorded on October 28th, 2024. I've really enjoyed reading KoozArch over the last few years and encourage you to follow their work. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month through our companion Substack. Visit surfacepodcast.substack.com to help support the show. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.